Good morning, dear students. In this, we are going to see menstrual cycle, fertilization and implantation, embryonic development and pasteurization. Let us see one by one. There are three phases in the life of the living organisms: juvenile, reproductive and senescence. During the reproductive phase, organisms give birth to offspring. Interestingly, most organisms display certain morphological and physiological changes during the reproductive phase. Human females, for instance, experienced the menstrual cycle, which is defined as cyclical changes in the genital system during the reproductive phase. Incidentally, the woman experiences her first menstrual cycle called demenarche at the onset of puberty, usually between the ages of 9 and 12, occurring approximately every 28 days. A single menstrual cycle consists of 4 phases: menstrual phase, follicular or proliferative phase, ovulatory phase, and lastly the luteal or secretory phase. Each phase of the menstrual cycle is marked by the simultaneous changes in the uterus, ovary and the secretions of hormones. For instance, during the menstrual phase, the endometrial lining of the uterus and its blood vessels break down and mix with the blood, mucus and other cell debris to form menses. The menses are discharged through the vagina as menstruation or menstrual flow, which lasts for 3 to 5 days from the beginning of the menstrual cycle. Interestingly, the absence of menstruation indicates pregnancy or ovarian disorders such as polycystic ovarian disorders or even factors such as stress and ill health. The menstrual phase is followed by the follicular phase, which occurs between days 6 and 14 of the menstrual cycle. During this phase, the primary follicle in the ovary matures into the Graafian follicle. Simultaneously, the endometrium undergoes proliferation, a process of regeneration which results in the formation of new thick endometrium. The follicular phase is followed by the ovulatory phase, which occurs during the middle of each menstrual cycle. During this phase, the Graafian follicle ruptures to release an ovum or egg cell into the pelvic cavity in a process called ovulation. The ovulatory phase is succeeded by the luteal or secretory phase, the last phase of the menstrual cycle, which occurs between days 16 and 28 of the menstrual cycle. This phase sees the transformation of the remaining Graafian follicle into a yellow mass called the corpus luteum. The endometrium too thickens and its blood vessels become coiled and enlarged. Interestingly, the endometrium and corpus luteum play a vital role during the early stages of conception. For instance, the fertilized egg gets embedded in the endometrium and derives nourishment from it. The corpus luteum, on the other hand, starts secreting progesterone that helps maintaining the endometrium and encourages the growth of the developing embryo. Conversely, in the absence of fertilization, the corpus luteum degenerates and triggers the breakdown of the endometrium. This marks the start of the menstruation and the beginning of the new menstrual cycle. Did you know that the phases of the menstrual cycle are controlled by the interplay of different hormones secreted by the ovary and the pituitary gland? At the onset of menses, the anterior pituitary gland increases the secretion of the two gonadotrophic hormones, luteinizing hormone or LH and follicular stimulatory hormone or FSH that stimulates the development of primary follicles. However, the amount of estrogen and progesterone released by the ovary during this time is less, which causes the thinning of the endometrium. The release of LH and FSH keeps increasing, and during the follicular stage, these two hormones stimulate the maturation of the primary follicle into the Graafian follicle. Moreover, LH and FSH stimulates the maturing follicles to release estrogen, a hormone that helps in the proliferation of the endometrium. The increased levels of estrogen in turn cause the anterior pituitary gland to release a surge of LH and FSH. So much so that by the ovulation phase, the levels of LH and FSH in the blood are at their peak. This LH surge causes ovulation by rupturing the Graafian follicle and turning the follicle's remnants into the corpus luteum. The estrogen level in the body too reaches its peak, and we see a gradual thickening of the endometrium. However, once the corpus luteum begins secreting large amounts of progesterone and FSH and LH inhibiting hormone, the levels of both these hormones drop, which in turn also lowers the levels of estrogen in the body. However, the endometrium continues its thickening because of its increasing level of progesterone. Incidentally, the corpus luteum will keep secreting progesterone if a fertilized egg gets embedded in the endometrium. However, in the absence of a fertilized egg, the corpus luteum stops releasing progesterone and degenerates. A drop in the level of progesterone in turn triggers menstruation as well as the restart of the release of LH and FSH by the pituitary gland. Menstrual cycles normally stop once a woman reaches her 50s. This phase is called menopause. The menstrual cycle is an important process in women's body, and it consists of 4 phases which are controlled by the hormones released by the ovary and the pituitary gland. Fertilization or fusion of gametes is the most vital event in the process of sexual reproduction, as it results in new life. In humans, while the male gamete or sperm is motile, the female gamete or ovum is non-motile. Therefore, for fertilization to occur, the two gametes must be brought together. This is achieved through insemination, where the penis releases semen filled with thousands of sperms into the vagina. Interestingly, while half of the total sperm released carry the X chromosome, the other half contain the Y chromosome. These sperms then rapidly move through the cervix, passed through the uterus, and finally reach the ampullary isthmic junction of the fallopian tube. In the meantime, the ovum, after completing the first meiotic division, gets released into the fallopian tube with the rupture of the Graafian follicle. Upon its release, the ovum begins to undergo the second meiotic division. However, the division does not go beyond the first phase. Interestingly, the ovum contains only the X chromosome. Studies have shown that the ovum is filled with cytoplasm called the yolk or vitalis, surrounded by a membrane called the vitelline membrane. The vitelline membrane is ensconced in another membrane called zona pellucida. However, there is some space between the zona pellucida and the vitelline membrane, which is called the perivitelline space. Surrounding the zona pellucida is a layer of granulosa cells called the cells of corona radiata. The ovum present in the fallopian tube now starts drifting towards the uterus. Once it reaches the ampullary isthmic junction, the ovum gets bombarded by several thousand sperms. However, only one sperm penetrates zona pellucida and initiates the fertilization process. Moreover, this penetrating sperm induces the zona pellucida to stiffen, which prevents other sperms from entering the ovum. After gaining entry through the zona pellucida, the acrosome present over the sperm's nucleus starts secreting enzymes that aid the sperm head to get through the ovum's cytoplasm, while the sperm sheds its tail. The fertilized egg now resumes the remaining phases of the second meiotic division. However, this division being unequal results in the formation of two unequal bodies, a haploid ovum called oocyte and a second polar body. While the second polar body degenerates, the oocyte and haploid nucleus of the sperm fused together to form a diploid zygote. Did you know that the sex of the zygote is decided at the time of fertilization? If the ovum is fertilized by a sperm containing the X chromosome, the resulting zygote contains XX chromosomes and would develop into a female. However, if the sperm containing the Y chromosome fertilizes the ovum, the resultant XY zygote develops into a male. Thus, it is the sperm that decides the sex of the fetus. A little more than a day after its formation, the zygote starts moving down the fallopian tube. Simultaneously, the zygote also undergoes mitotic division, and with each successive division, the number of daughter cells doubles. This division is termed as cleavage, while the resultant daughter cells are called blastomeres. About 3 days after fertilization, the zygote contains nearly 8 to 16 cells and is called amarula. Over a period of 2 days, the amarula descends down into the uterus and transforms itself into a blastocyst. The hollow ball composed of about 100 blastomeres, which are arranged in 2 layers. The outer layer, called the trophoblast, eventually gives rise to the placenta, while the inner layer, consisting of a group of cells called the inner cell mass, eventually differentiates to form the embryo. Interestingly, at the blastocyst stage, the zygote, now called the embryo, gets attached to the uterus as the trophoblast grows outwards and penetrates the endometrial lining of the uterus. In response, the endometrial cells divide and start surrounding the blastocyst. This causes the blastocyst to sink and get implanted into the uterus. Once implantation has occurred, pregnancy gets initiated. Moreover, after implantation, inner cell masses gets differentiated and begin to form the embryo. Embryo formation is thus a complex process that begins with the fertilization and ends with the implantation of the embryo. The joys of holding a newborn baby know no bounds. The birth of the baby is an intricate and complex process that begins when the zygote undergoes cleavage and develops into a blastocyst, the hollow ball consisting of a trophoblast and inner cell mass and the cavity called blastocele. As the trophoblast grows outwards and penetrates the endometrial lining of the uterus, the blastocyst with the developing embryo gets implanted in the uterus and pregnancy is initiated. After implantation, the trophoblast grows further, which causes the blastocyst to sink in and get covered by the cells of the uterus. As the blastocyst sinks further into the uterus, finger-like projections called chorionic villi start appearing on the trophoblast. As the chorionic villi grow further, they interlock with the uterine tissues to form the placenta, a structural and functional unit between the developing embryo and maternal body. Interestingly, when the placenta begins to form, the inner cell mass moves downwards and differentiates to form an embryonic disc consisting of three germ layers: the outer ectoderm, middle mesoderm, and inner endoderm. The term germ layer indicates that each of the layers give rise to tissues. The ectoderm, for instance, gives rise to the nervous system and the skin, whereas the mesoderm develops into muscles and organs such as the heart and kidneys, while the endoderm gives rise to the entire digestive system. Did you know that apart from the three germ layers, the embryonic disc also contains certain cells called stem cells, which have the ability to give rise to all the tissues and organs present in the human body? As the embryonic disc grows, the cells of one side of the disc grows faster than those on the other side. This causes the disc to roll and form a cylindrical embryo. Initially, this embryo is attached to the placenta, but as it starts to develop, it moves away from the placenta and remains connected to it via an umbilical cord. The placenta is an important structure that supplies the embryo with oxygen, nutrients, and hormones, as well as carries waste products from the embryo back to the mother. The embryo stays inside the uterus for 9 months, which is called the gestation period. During this period, the embryo undergoes several developments. By the end of the first month, the embryo develops a heart, while the end of the second month marked the transition of an embryo to a fetus with developing fetal limbs and digits. And by the end of the third month, most of the organs are already formed. Another 4 months, the fetus is rapidly growing weight and its bones get stronger. By the beginning of the 9th month, the fetus is fully developed and assumes that position it will take during the delivery. Interestingly, while the fetus is undergoing several developmental changes, the mother's body too is undergoing several hormonal changes. The ovary, for example, starts secreting a hormone called relaxin. Likewise, the placenta starts secreting hormones such as human chorionic gonadotropin or HCG and human placental lactation or HPL. Incidentally, HCG, HPL and relaxin are secreted only when a woman is pregnant. Apart from secreting of these hormones, the levels of other hormones such as estrogen, progesterone, Cortisol, prolactin, and thyroxine also rise rapidly in the pregnant woman's body. These hormones support the growth of the fetus as well as maintain the pregnancy. Increased levels of progesterone and estrogen, for instance, put the menstrual cycle on hold and prevent the shedding of the uterine lining, which is embedded with the developing fetus. Hormonal changes also cause the cells of the mother's mammary glands to differentiate, resulting in these glands producing milk by a process called lactation towards the end of the pregnancy. Did you know that at the end of the gestation period, the fetus as well as the placenta start secreting hormones that set in motion mild uterine contractions called the fetal ejection reflex? These contractions in turn act on the mother's pituitary gland and now start secreting oxytocin, the hormone that causes stronger uterine contractions. The simultaneous uterine contractions and oxytocin release makes the contraction stronger with every passing minute and ultimately results in the expulsion of the baby from the mother's uterus. This process of delivery of the fetus is called parturition. Immediately after the birth of the baby, the placenta is expelled from the uterus. Soon after birth, the baby needs to be breastfed by the mother as early as possible. This is because immediately after parturition, the mammary glands start secreting colostrum, a form of milk that is rich in antibodies and improves the immune system of the baby. Every baby thus begins its journey as a zygote, which develops into a fetus over 9 months. Sono alzato, oh bella ciao,